There we go. So good evening. It's good to see you all. And I'm sure there will be a few more logging on in the next minute or two as well. This is the last in our four-part series looking at the history of women in the rabbinate. I'm going to deviate a little bit from the path set by the WRN curriculum this evening. I'd looked at the materials they provided, and it was all interesting material. A lot of it looking at some of the work that the women rabbis have done sort of more institutionally over the last years, particularly on issues of equal pay or family leave, those kinds of issues, some of which have come up in conversation, especially I brought them up particularly in conversation with Rabbi Haken last week. So I decided not to spend, I didn't want to spend a whole evening in our four-part session looking at those issues. Those are issues that are relevant to the rabbinate, but they're relevant in many ways to all areas of professional life in which women have sought equality. And what I was led to instead was that because of a couple of the resources that the WRN had shared, I went and did some exploring in this incredible video resource created over the last few years by the Jewish Women's Archive. And the Jewish Women's Archive is an organization, it has, if you go to jwa.org, I think, full of information. This is actually, I'm looking at Nancy, Elaine, others who have done some of the programming for the Rosh Chodesh group, is an incredible resource for you if you've not already found it, because they have pre-made sort of study guides on all kinds of things with primary sources to learn about different women in history, different issues. The resources that are available at the Jewish Women's Archive is incredible. And some of them are documents and texts, that you can read as background. What we looked at last week, at the beginning of last week, that timeline of firsts of women in the rabbinate was created by the JWA. It was on their website. But in addition to that, they have a YouTube channel, just like our congregation has its own YouTube channel, where they upload all of the videos of lectures and presentations that they have done over the past few years. And one of the things they've been doing as an archive is to collect interviews with all kinds of women rabbis. From different countries, from different moments, people who are influential because of what they did, or they were firsts, or they had very specific stories to tell and experiences. And what they've done is a lot of the video material that they've put up, they've segmented into little sort of 1.5, 2-minute little clips where you hear a particular woman talking on a very specific topic. And so we're going to dig into some of that amazing resource tonight on a number of issues that I've chosen to sort of make the issues that I want to highlight. And what I thought we would do is that we would listen to a few at a time. We get a little taste. But then what we can do is pause after sort of each themed mini collection that I've kind of curated for this evening and have a conversation about what we hear, what comes up for us, and some of the questions that it raises. So what I'm hoping to get to tonight, and I haven't timed it all to see if we can get it all in, but my goal is to begin with a series of firsts, because that's really been the theme. We looked at some of those, really sort of out front women who didn't have the title rabbi from previous centuries. Then we had the first of Regina Jonas and Sally Priesand. Then the first generation, the women ordained in the first 10 years, of which Rabbi Haken was one. And there have been many other firsts since. We can't get to them all, but I want to just give you a taste of just some of what they've reflected on in their experience of being firsts. Then I'd like to take a look at the question of what women in the rabbinate might have brought into Judaism with regard to changes in different ways of thinking about liturgy or ritual, and what they have contributed in that field. So we'll have a chance to have a little time to reflect on that. I do want to come back to a theme that has been there in the previous sessions, but to look in a more contemporary way in the last sort of 20, 30 years about the ongoing challenges. What are some of the experiences that women have had in the rabbinate? And then finally, one of the questions that comes up is, what kind of change have women brought to the rabbinate? And it's interesting to hear reflections from different women in the field as to whether this is something that's just the sort of natural evolution of a sort of the progressive edge of Judaism, or whether or not it is something that's really a much more radical transformation by having brought women into the clergy leadership of Judaism. So those are the things I hope to hit on. I do want to just begin the evening, though, with one other topic that I actually had as a potential topic to listen to some interviews, but I've decided it's too big and too potentially painful, potentially for some of us who are here, to do it justice in the midst of something that's trying to cover so many things. So if we discuss it, it'll be at another time in more depth. And I might actually reflect on some of this tomorrow night. If you've missed it in the headlines, the last couple of days in Jewish press, Hebrew Union College has just published a report that was independently produced by a law firm that they had asked to provide an opportunity for people who had had experiences over the decades in the college of any kind of discrimination, abuse, to be able to report. And many people reached out to the law firm and sent in, spoke to them, and there were many interviews held. I can't remember the total number, but I'm thinking it may be over 150. And the report is, pretty damning in its reflection of a lot of aspects of culture in the seminary that led to different kinds of abuse over the years. At the end of the report, it names 6 individuals in particular whose names came up over and over again, where there was overwhelming evidence from reports that all repeated similar themes about their misconduct, sexual misconduct. And among them are 2 who had incredibly senior positions, people who were, dean, president, the top of the chain when it came to the seminary. Neither of whom were there when I went through the seminary. If this report had come out before last Thursday, it would have been interesting to hear whether Rabbi Haken had anything to add or reflect, based on her experiences. But one of those named in particular was Alfred Gottschalk, who was head of the seminary for many years. And apparently it was a sort of not particularly well hidden secret that he was a sexual predator when it came to the women at the seminary. But nothing was ever said, nothing was ever done. And he was replaced by somebody else who was almost as bad. And the person who replaced him, Sheldon Zimmerman, he's been in the press several times earlier this year. He's still alive, and some reports came to light that Central Synagogue reported on earlier this year, because they did their own investigations into Sheldon Zimmerman, who had been senior rabbi there at one point. But it's something that just this week, there have been online gatherings of my colleagues, both male and female, who are just trying to absorb the content of the report. And to their credit, there's nothing secret about this. I'm telling you something that has been published to be known and to be seen and to be addressed. And the report makes a number of recommendations as to how the college can do better moving forward. But I've heard just in the last couple of days in some of these gatherings from women who we know, women who have been absolute leaders, influential rabbis, in incredibly influential rabbis in their field over the last number of decades, who had some of these experiences and survived to tell the tale and to go on to be incredible rabbis. So there's a sort of at the time that we're celebrating this coming up to 50 years of women in the rabbinate, This report comes out just to highlight that amongst all the celebrations, there's this sort of hidden underbelly that a lot of my colleagues have had experiences, and I have to be quite honest, and Debbie may be in the similar place to me. I have to be honest, I never had them personally. That's just because, sometimes things, not everything is seen or known by everyone. I had no idea of the reputation of Alfred Gottschalk. I had not heard any rumors. I was not aware at all. I became aware during the conference last year that there was something associated with him, but I had no idea of the details until I read the report 2 days ago. So, my experience both in the professional rabbinate in the 2 congregations that I've served and my experiences in the seminary were never anything other than completely positive. So I don't want to lose sight of those pieces of our experience as well. And you should know that the URJ is doing its own independent investigations, and the CCAR is as well. So, nobody likes to see the dirty laundry aired, but we can't change things unless we bring things out into the light. And the reform movement is somewhat ahead of some of the other Jewish denominations in doing this right now in an incredibly transparent and open way. But I say that just because I would not be surprised in the coming months if we don't hear more names being brought to light of people who have been abusive in their roles as senior rabbis in congregations, and others who have wielded power inappropriately in other positions within the movement. So that's the kind of the downer. But I just, in case you hear, you see these headlines, I saw Natalie nodding her head. I think she had. So others of you, if you're looking and you're reading about it, I believe the report is available on HUC's website. I don't think it was a private link just for us. I think it is available to be read, because they really are trying to bring things out into bright sunlight, and address, think about how to do things better moving forward. So any questions, I mean, that's a lot to sort of take in if you had no idea that this was going on, but anybody have any immediate questions about that before I move on to where I really want to focus for the rest of the evening? Yeah, Phil, go ahead.
Has there been any ramifications for people if they're still alive and still, even if it's as a emeritus rabbi or something?
So of the 6 who were named as especially egregious cases at the end of the report, 4 are dead. Of the 2 who are still alive, Sheldon Zimmerman lives in Florida. He has, I think he's in Florida. He had been, might not be Florida, wherever he is, he had been doing some adjunct work for a congregation that he was sort of he's basically retired, but was connected to. That has now, ended. It ceased. And I believe, and I assume he has been kicked out of the CCAR. That may have happened some time ago. The other person who's still alive, who was mentioned among the 6, his consequences already happened a few years ago. Stephen Cohen, who's not a rabbi, but was a professor of sociology, and stories about him came to light 3 or 4 years ago. And he actually resigned from HUC rather than going through any kind of disciplinary procedure. But yeah, he's a kind of a person non grata right now in the field. And so that's what I can tell you about those 2. What I will say is, without having heard any specific names, is that my colleagues are aware that they reported on a lot of other people who maybe their actions did not rise to the level of these 6, but there are others who are still working, who are still part of the college infrastructure, or who have recently been, and because their names have not come to light, there is a question mark as to whether or not there will be any further consequences for those that we assume that the law firm will pass on to the college to make them aware of those other reports, even if they didn't rise to a level of being publicly put out in the report in this way, because obviously when something is less than crystal clear, you don't want to sully someone's reputation until you're absolutely sure of what it is they are accused of. So that's what I can tell you for now. Yeah.
Wow.
One of the things that's come up as a question and people are grappling with in the field, both women and men as well, is that because of the positions they held, Gottschalk and Zimmerman are like the two primary signatures on many people's smicha, ordination certificates. And how does that feel? To look at those ordination certificates and to see those names there. And so one of the things that the law firm actually suggested was there might be some process by which people might have the opportunity to have, a reissued ordination certificate. What people are struggling with is that those ordination certificates, if you ever come into my office and you look behind my desk, there's a whole list of signatures. Many, not all, but many of the professors would come in and would sign our ordination certificates. And there are people who are beloved, like Aaron Pankin of blessed memory, who died a few years ago. You can't get those signatures back. It's not, and others who, from decades ago who are no longer alive. And so there are many good people who signed those ordination certificates, and you don't want to lose that. So there isn't really a good solution to that, but people are trying to grapple with those kinds of issues. By the time I was at the college, the president was David Ellenson, who was a dear, delightful man, and his wife is a rabbi as well. And so, as I said, I didn't have to deal with any of those kinds of issues that some of my earlier colleagues have now brought to light. Okay, so
Rachel,
let's
can
shift.
I ask one quick question?
Yeah, please go ahead, Marilyn.
Were any of these allegations raised or known at the time that they were occurring and either ignored or swept under the rug?
Some were and some were not. Yeah. And in fact, in each of those cases where they named these particular individuals, they actually, in the report, they review that in depth. They say, was there anything on file to indicate anybody had ever made a report? Was there ever anything done about it? In no case was there ever anything done about it at the time, other than perhaps a slap on the wrist, but nothing of any consequence. And often in several occasions, I mean, when it came to the provost, the president of the whole seminary, people, who would you report to? I mean, he was the top of the, he was the top of the chain, and these were students who were worried about their careers. Would they get ordained? Would some excuse be made to kick them out of the college? Would there be whispers that would go out so that when they were in placement, they would be blacklisted and wouldn't get a job? And so fear held many back from reporting at the time. But yet it was this sort of kind of known thing. A number of my colleagues would talk about, sort of don't ever be in the elevator alone with X. Watch out, if this one invites you to their apartment in Jerusalem, watch out for. So clearly something was known. And there's no way that it wasn't known by people who were working at the college as well. And it was never addressed. It was never dealt with. So a lot to try and absorb there. Okay, we're going to switch gears, something something a little more uplifting. So I want to go through this series of firsts, and I'm going to begin with just a very brief piece from Rabbi Amy Ellberg. Not because I think that necessarily she offers something new for us to hear, but just more that she echoes things that we have already heard earlier in the course. She was the first woman to be ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary, so she was the first conservative rabbi woman to be ordained, and that didn't happen until 1985. If you remember the timeline, Sally Priesand, 1972, and the first woman in the conservative movement was ordained in 1975. Sorry, 1985. So let's go here, and here we go.
So I guess it became clear that I was going to be the first at the very beginning. So women were admitted. The class of the rabbinical school that was admitted in 1984 included women. But it became clear when the dean and I looked at my transcript that it would be a full year, but it was really just a year's worth of coursework. So, and there was no other woman who had quite that little left to do. It was heady, it was exciting. I'd been hoping and praying and working for this for a long time, as I knew, so many people had. I knew it would be historic. I knew it would have great symbolic value in terms of the equality of women in Jewish life. And by then I was 30. I had no idea what it would be like then to carry that, moniker of the first later in life. So it was exciting. It was high pressure, a lot of scrutiny. I didn't notice it at the time because I was so single-mindedly focused. Like, I was on a mission. And I remember, sometimes I would study for a test and I thought, you have to ace everything because you can't give them any excuse to say, no, you didn't pass that one, you're going to have to, whatever. We're not going to ordain you after all.
I'm going to just run through several of these and then we'll have a chance to reflect and chat. The next is Rabbi Deborah Harris. She was born in the United States, but she's been living in the UK for quite a few years. So she has the reverse of my accent. It's quite entertaining for me to listen to. She's actually listed here as the first woman to be the principal of a seminary, which in fact is not, she actually in the course of the interview acknowledges is not technically correct, that Shahama Weiner was the first at the Academy of Jewish Religion in New York, which is where Surrey was ordained. She was the principal of that seminary before Deborah Harris became the principal at Leo Baeck College in London. But at that time, AJR did not have quite the same profile as the other seminaries. It was not an accredited program, which we will not bore you with the details of what that means and what the difference is and the hoops that they had to jump through to get official accreditation, which they now are. But anyway, Deborah Harris, nevertheless, is a first or close to it, in the same way that Sally Priesand was very close to being the first.
When I decided to apply for the job of principal of Leo Baeck College, it's not a job that comes up very often. And when I applied, first of all, I didn't think I'd get it. I just thought it's come up now, and I think that the governors don't really know who I am. It's a good opportunity for them to know me, and maybe I'll get a job teaching. I had been doing a little teaching, but maybe they'll try and find me a more substantial job or something. Of course, I wanted to do it, and I was very prepared to do it, but I still wasn't sure that was the moment that it was going to happen for me. And I was so engrossed in thinking about how am I going to get this job and how am I going to, really persuade them that I can do this, that it never occurred to me that I was a woman and that would even be an issue. So it wasn't until after I was appointed that somebody said, you're the first woman to do this job. And there's never been a female president of HUC or the equivalent at the Reconstructionists. And we only discovered after I'd been appointed that there had been the Academy for Jewish Religion in New York. Shahama had done it, but it was still quite newsworthy. And I was sort of really taken aback. I was like, oh. So I was really taken aback by a lot of just even the discussion of it. So there were a lot of people really excited, and I'm just saying, but don't be excited because I'm female, be excited because I'm me, because I'm going to be great at this. I'm so excited to do this. This is the job I most want in the world, and I love this institution. This is what I want to do. Who cares if I'm a Martian? You should be excited that it's me doing this. So it was both positive and negative, even just to get the reaction that it was an issue at all. So far, I would say confidently that there's never been a really negative reaction, as in you shouldn't be doing it. it's been more the kind of sense that it's newsworthy that's been kind of almost strange to me.
Next up, I'm going to play a short clip from Maya Leibowitz. Maya Leibowitz is one of the early women rabbis serving in Israel. The women who are serving as rabbis in Israel are really remarkable because their context is a whole different context, and we'll hear more about that actually a little bit later this evening, I think. But she was the first woman to get to lead a military funeral and memorial in Israel. You can imagine the sort of machismo that goes around that and the whole military piece, and that she had this opportunity. So this is her reflecting on that first.
We have an enormous trouble in, you see, Israel, in Israel, the funerals are led by the Chevra Kadisha, and the Chevrot Kadisha have become more and more strict, and they wouldn't allow a woman to lead services. In some graveyards, in some cemeteries, they allow you, after they are finished, to do what you want, but they won't allow you to be part of it. A military funeral is a completely different thing, because military people are there and they're shooting into the sky, and the whole service is much more ceremonial and very strict in the way it's built. So for a woman to be part of a military service is even more. I've become the rabbi. There is a family in Arad who've had, every boy killed in the army. It's a beautiful Israeli thing. The army sends years after a group from the same battalion, from the same troop, to the Memorial Day. And a military rabbi will do the service. Now this family, the Weinstein family, have had military rabbis for years, and they remembered me because I lived in Arab for many years. And after, I don't know how many years, they finally found me and they asked me, would I please do the service for them. For the first year when I did it, the military group was in a shock. They've never seen a woman rabbi lead a commemoration service, so they didn't even come close to ask me questions. But the person, I don't know how, the corporal, whatever the degrees in English, came up to me afterwards. We always go to their home, and said to me, it was very strange for me to listen to you because you were a woman. But the fact that you were there opened a window in my mind.
Lots to absorb in these little tastes. Next one is a woman also in Israel called Miri Fagelson. Just like in what we learned of our history, that while Sally was the first woman to be ordained by a seminary, that she was in fact not the first woman ever to be ordained a rabbi, because Regina Jonas had private smicha. So it is that we're going to hear next, actually after this one, from Sarah Hurwitz, who was the first woman to be ordained through Chovevei Torah, the Maharat program, which is this modern Orthodox seminary in New York City that is now ordaining women in the modern Orthodox world. But that was the first seminary program. But prior to that, there were other women who had received private smicha within the Orthodox world. And one of them was Miri Fagelson, and her ordination came from Rabbi Shlomo Kolbach, which when we have, going back to where I started this evening, when we're talking about rabbis who have very complex histories, and particularly in the sphere of sexual abuse, Shlomo Kolbach is a very, very complicated person for us to grapple with and relate with today. But nevertheless, he ordained Rabbi Fagelsen, and it's interesting to hear her reflection on how that was regarded by others. Okay, here we go.
You know, the day itself was one of the greatest days of my life and one of the hardest days of my life. We used to joke that it was the most known secret in all of Yerushalayim. The ceremony was very private. I actually wanted to split the smicha ceremony between me and my smicha chavruta, Rabbi Amy Ellberg, because I felt that he deserved a very public ceremony, and I knew that my ceremony needed to be very private. And he was amazing, and he said, we've never not learned a moment together, and we're not learning together now. So we both shared the ceremony, and it was a very private ceremony. It was very hard in the beginning. I felt that the community now can hear things that it couldn't hear 10 years ago. And I'm blessed to see. Every day is eternity, and in history, 10 years is nothing. And I live in both of those realities. For me, every day, talking about myself in the third person, as if I don't exist, was devastating. And it happened. Hi, Mimi, I'm doing a documentary on women in Israel, and I was told to talk to you as a woman who wanted to receive ordination but couldn't. Sorry, not me. What do you mean? Well, if you want to talk to me as a woman who wanted to receive ordination but couldn't, that's not me. But I know a woman who did receive ordination. Maybe she'll be willing to talk to you. I'm sure she'll want to consult with her rabbis first. And after 15 minutes of having this conversation, sitting in my own living room, talking about myself in the third person, I said to Yaakov Friedland, I said, can we start over again? He said, what? I said, trust me. He said, hi, Mimi, blah, 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 blah. I said, not me. What do you mean, not you? If you want to talk to me as the one who wanted to receive ordination and couldn't, it's not me, because I have it. What? I have it. And all those things I said about that woman, that's me. So now let's talk.
I'm going to go straight to the last in this particular series of first, Sarah Hurwitz, and her experience of being the first in the Maharat program in New York.
Titles are an interesting thing. For me, it's never been about title. It's really being present for congregants and being there at their times of greatest joy and their moments of vulnerability. But what I came to realize is that title helps you do the job better. It helps you be more present for people. So when I walk into a Shiva house, a house of mourning, when I walk in as just Sarah Hurwitz, I have to sit quietly and wait to be spoken to. But when I walk in as the rabbinic presence, I'm there for a purpose. I'm there to comfort, to my hand around the mourner, if it's a woman, and just to create a certain space of comfort. Perhaps it's to get the Shiva minyan, the service that is done in a Shiva house, in a house of mourning. And so the title lets people know what service I offer. I think that we had hoped that Maharat would come to mean a rabbi, and we want to help people understand that Maharat does actually perform the function of what a rabbi does, with some distinctions. But Rabbah, for me, was a title that more easily described who I am and what I do. We didn't actually expect the controversy that boiled around the title. It seemed to, at the time, we thought that there was acceptance of who I was and what I was doing, but we were wrong. 2020 hindsight is a wonderful thing. But what happened is that the Orthodox community wasn't ready for an RB sounding title, for a title that sounded too much like rabbi. And so I realized that it became increasingly necessary and important to help people understand that rabbi is distinct from rabbi, although the role on a day-to-day basis is really the same.
So just to fill in a little bit of the story there, when Sarah Hurwitz was ordained, this program had existed for several years. The women had been in training. It wasn't a secret that this was going on, but that when she tried to use the the title Rabbah in the first instance. Avi Weiss, the rabbi who had created this program and was overseeing it, was basically threatened with expulsion from the Orthodox world. And other rabbis who had gone through the Chovevei program would also have been ostracized, which would have created complications for them in terms of recognition of things like when they do conversions, a number of things. So they had to tread this line and backtrack a little bit. Since then, there are many women who have gone through the Maharat program who are using the title Rabbah. And there are still many in the Orthodox world who don't like it. But there are enough liberal modern Orthodox communities that have embraced it and have sought out and actually hired these women and given them jobs within their communities that, a niche has been carved out. So again, a lot happens in just, a decade, just within a few years. So that was a lot, just a kind of a whole smorgasbord of different kinds of firsts. And I just want to open it up to see, what jumped out at you? What did you hear that sort of really sort of landed with you as being a poignant or an interesting reflection of these women as they were telling their stories?
What surprised me was the Israeli rabbi who did the funeral services. Since there's so many women in the military in Israel, I was surprised that would be such an issue to lead a military service.
Yeah, it's very interesting how in Israel the sort of these that there's this sort of people kind of partition their minds, right? The women have been accepted in just about every role within the military in Israel, but yet within the rabbinate it is the world that world at a governmental level is controlled by the Orthodox, and for them it's a great threat to their authority and their power and control of religious life in Israel, if anything outside of their world is allowed in. Iris, I know you're going to have something to say about that. Go ahead. I'll just unmute yourself because we don't hear you yet.
Yes, as somebody who served in the military, who was part of the Reform congregation in Israel, and knows firsthand both sides. Even me saying Kaddish for my dad and later for my mom was something that was, oh my God, she's going to, my dad didn't have it, my parents never had any boy children, so it was me. It was a shock for some that I say the Kaddish. So the fact that a woman rabbi is, so there's two parts. One is women are not seen as religious beings on their own. They're only supportive of their male counterpart, husband, son, father. They cannot be, it's very orthodox. In Israel, there is something which is called, you're either orthodox or you're not religious. And if you're not religious, you're not religious orthodox. I don't know how to explain that, but that's pretty much how people are. The Reform movement is growing. I'm proof of that. I joined the Reform movement in 1978, I would say. I was 12, 13, so that's around the time, 78. So there was a Reform movement, but it was very slow. So you have two things. You have a woman who is standing there as a religious authority, which is very hard for Israelis to explain. I actually got yelled at by a supermarket manager because he saw my American credit card, and then he goes, oh, in America, Jews are not Jews because women wear talit. So that's a supermarket manager. So if you think about it, his children are going to the army. Everybody's going to the army. They don't see that vision of a woman rabbi, of a woman of religious authority. So there's that. And there's the other thing that people like me who are not Orthodox, most of the time, just don't care about religion. So they don't see women rabbis because they're so put off by religion that they're anti-religion. So they won't see a woman rabbi because they won't see a rabbi because they will stay as far away from anything that smells like religion.
Yeah,
And that's
thank
what the
you.
Reform congregations in Israel are fighting against.
Right, but we'll get to it a little bit later with somebody actually reflecting on this directly. Numbers make a difference. The HUC in Jerusalem has now ordained over 100 Reform rabbis, and the conservative movement, the Masorti movement in Israel, has ordained, I don't know what their numbers are, but similar or more. And so it is now just like, you know, we Debbie talked last week about, you know, how she might confront, you know, the people who, you know, genuinely had never met a woman rabbi before, right? For the first, you know, good number of years, you know, that she was among the first, and it was a new experience. And how do you respond to people's lack of familiarity and discomfort? So likewise, we're now getting to numbers of non-Orthodox rabbis of both genders in Israel, such that more and more people can say, I have met someone. I went to a wedding. It was wonderful. I did this. I went to a bar bat mitzvah. It was wonderful. And so, yeah, we're beginning to see those changes. It'll be interesting to see. And of course, the more those changes come, the more there's pushback as the Orthodox try and maintain control of their position within the society. Cheryl, go ahead. I know you've been waiting.
So without taking notes or anything, and so it's hard to remember exactly from the 5 different clips, but the feeling I kind of got overall was that as women, we are still apologizing for our achievements, keeping things secret. You don't want to come out too forceful, backtracking in our talk a little bit, and that same feeling of apologizing for our achievements.
Natalie.
Yeah, to follow on Cheryl's comment, I did take some notes, and a couple of the women expressed surprise that there would be a reaction to them as female rabbis, or didn't want to be a symbol, didn't, you know, see themselves as the first. And it seems to be the younger ones, or opinions they had when they were younger. And I think as they mature, what we're hearing is a recognition of their place in history. Because if you are going to be the first, whether it was your choice or not, you do have a role to play. You may not have chosen it, but to ignore it, to pretend it doesn't exist, is to lose an opportunity to influence the future and have a role in history and be recognized for it. And you know, people don't always sign up for the responsibilities, but nonetheless, it's an opportunity, you know, to really make something of it and be a symbol. And yes, it's harder. And yes, there's a lot of stress and pressure, but that's where you are and that's who you are. And I think even though there are many, I mean, like more than 1,000 female rabbis in the US at this point, it's still groundbreaking in some areas, and to recognize that and to understand your role in it, I think is important, and something that I hope is taught. So people understand it.
Yeah, thank you. We'll take one more comment before I want to move to our sort of second set of themes. Elaine, go ahead.
Just to follow up again with what Natalie said, who followed up on what Cheryl said, the woman, she was in purple, who had the secret ordination. She basically said it. She's like, this is me. This is me. The person I talked about was me. And although she didn't say it, I heard, get over it. You know, this is who I am. And like I say, get over it. And I thought she was very clear about making herself heard and making herself known in that way.
Right. And I do think that, you know, that she grappled with what we saw the others grappling with, which is that, you know, how you find that balance when you are the first between, you know, not being so secretive, you know, that no one knows that you can't be who you are. You can't do what it is you have trained to do. But at the same time, if you come out, particularly when you're at the cutting edge in communities that may not have been, you know, so-called ready for it, that if you come out with too much of a splash, the backlash or the pushback to just symbolically what you represent can be a barrier to you then going and doing the very thing that it is you want to do. And so trying to sort of hold that balance. I did say I was going to go on, but sorry, go ahead. One more comment and then I'm going to move on. Sorry, did you freeze? Yeah, it looks like her. Okay, I will go on. It looks like her camera has frozen. Okay, so what I want to move now, and I know there's much more we can say. I'm moving us through quickly because there's just, I was overwhelmed by the material that we could have been discussing. I could do another 4-week class just based on these clips. But I want to move to ritual change. What impact have women in the, and I want to be just acknowledge up front, lots of women have innovated in Judaism and brought ritual change and language change and innovation, and they weren't all rabbis. I mean, Suri was part of one of the very first Rosh Chodesh groups. They were innovating with ritual and music, and they weren't rabbis. Now, actually in her group, now 3 of her group are rabbis, and one of them helps to train rabbis. But at the time when they were bringing ritual innovation into the Jewish world, they were not rabbis. So there are many women over the last 50 years who have brought ritual innovation into the Jewish world. But we want to focus a little bit on some of the rabbinic leadership. So we're going to start with Rabbi Laura Geller, who is a really wonderful rabbi. She was ordained in the 1970s. She was among the early ones. I think she was ordained in 1978. So she was definitely there in the first 10 of the women to be ordained from HUC.
I have a very strong memory of the first day. This is a story I've told before. The first day of my Talmud class, a wonderful professor who never had a woman student before. And he begins the class as he had for, 30 years, 40 years, pounding on the table, "Gentlemen, let us begin." He looks up and he sees me and he says, "Gentleman and lady," and he said, "That doesn't sound right." And he says, "Gentleman and Laura." I mean, genuinely wanting to include me in the conversation. And he, as many people do, we began our study of Talmud with Tractate Brachot, which is a section of Talmud that deals with prayer and blessings. So this professor began by saying, God is present at all times, and we have a tradition of saying blessings as a way of acknowledging the presence of divinity. Jewish tradition tells us that you're supposed to say 100 blessings a day. 100 times during the day you stop and acknowledge that divinity is present. And then he said, there is no important moment in the lifetime of a Jew for which there is no blessing. And I remember thinking, wow, there's no important moment in the lifetime of a Jew for which there is no blessing. Divinity is present. It's just up to me to be present to the presence of divinity and acknowledge that God is here among us. And I have a very vivid memory of where I was sitting, looking out over 68th Street in New York City, and suddenly I realized that it wasn't true. There had been important moments in my lifetime for which there was no blessing. So I am now 23 years old maybe, sitting in this New York City classroom, and suddenly I became again a 13-year-old girl who had just gotten her period. I remember the moment I came out of the bathroom, I went to my mother and I said, "Mom, I just got my period." And my mother said, when I got my period, my mother slapped me. And I said, "What? Why did Nana slap you?" She said, "I have absolutely no idea. Go and ask her." I got on my bicycle, rode to my grandmother's house, and I said, "Nana, why did you slap Mom when she got her period?" And my grandmother, an American-born woman, doesn't speak a word of Yiddish, says to me in this Yiddish accent that I'd never heard before and never heard a subsequent, "She was losing blood, she was a little pale, she needed color in her cheeks." End of story. I never thought about that moment again until I'm sitting in this rabbinical school classroom, and suddenly it occurred to me, what if my mother and I had prepared for that moment, not only by reading all the stuff about what was going on in my body. My mother was very good about that. I understood what was happening. But what if in preparation we had talked about the spiritual power of that moment? And when I got my period, what if my mother and I had said a blessing? A blessing as simple as the Shechianu, thanking God for bringing us to this moment. Or a blessing as simple as, thank you, God, for making me a woman. How would that have affected my experience as a Jewish woman? So at that moment, sitting in the class, I realized that what my teacher said needed to be true, that there be no important moment in the lifetime of a Jew for which there is no blessing, and that Jewish women's stories and life experience are part of that, and that we need to create new rituals to acknowledge the truth of that statement, that there's no important moment in the lifetime of a Jew for which there is no blessing.
Really wonderful. I'm going to, again, like I did last time, play a little series before we discuss. So the next one is a conservative ordained rabbi, wonderful rabbi called Deborah Ornstein. And I think she also discusses this idea of women's contribution to the ritual life in a really beautiful way. So we're going to hear her next.
Another way to look at women's influence is to think of it in terms of ritual. How has ritual changed because of women's participation? And the first thing that happened was that men became aware of their own life cycle and their own rituals. And I think you can really see this most strongly with bris and naming ceremonies for both boys and girls. We had this real gap between boys and girls, that on the 8th day, all the family flies in, there's a big party. Doesn't matter if it's Shabbat or if it's Yom Kippur, the Moel comes, everybody makes time in their schedules. No matter how inconvenient, we're all there because a baby boy was born and he needs to be brought into the covenant. Versus the daughter gets named over the Torah sometime after the birth, generally with the mother and the baby absent, no fanfare. Sometimes in the Sephardic community there was something called the Zevet Habat, a little bit of an extra ritual component, but really so little was done. We saw this big gap between how boys were welcomed in the world versus how girls were welcomed in the world. But as soon as we became aware of that and started practicing ceremonies for girls and creating covenant ceremonies and imagining, well, is it about a girl being welcomed into her name? Is it about a girl being welcomed into the covenant, into her femininity? What's happening in this ceremony? And we started using different ritual objects and different ritual themes, whether it was Rosh Chodesh or Shabbat or candles or wrapping her in a talit, taking a pinprick of blood from her foot, using some of the language from the Brit, all the different ways that people started doing this. It created a whole little cottage industry of baby naming girl ceremonies. And people would cut and paste and phone their local resource center and write away for different ceremonies. And then within one generation, we went from saying, well, how can we do less for our daughters, where we don't memorialize this moment and we don't consider it important, we don't have the ceremony and the pomp and the circumstances, to saying, how can we do less for our sons? That when boys get named, nobody makes a special booklet. Nobody thinks about the meaning of the ritual. The Moel comes, the Moel mumbles, everybody eats lox. That's it. You know, it's just devoid of this whole wrestling around what is the meaning of the name, what is the meaning of a naming ceremony. We just did what we'd always done. And now Brit became reinvigorated, re-energized, where people would start again talking about the name of the child and the meaning of covenant and why we're here in a much deeper way than had been done for the previous few decades. So that to me is the great gift of women's inclusion, is not just that now 50% more of the population is on the books and being addressed, but that there's 100% more meaning for everybody looking at these passages.
Last but not least, in this little section, we're going to listen to Miri Gold, another wonderful rabbi from Israel, also reflecting on rituals for women.
When I was 31, I had a miscarriage, and there was no ritual. And it took me almost a year and a half when I was pregnant with my now first child to start mourning that previous loss, because I had no outlet to express it. It wasn't something that one did. And I think that it was finding expression that women had written that helped me go through a certain mourning period that was healthy, so that I could then move on with my life.
So as I said, not all of this was directly in the hands of women who were rabbis, but they certainly have had a contribution that has been made. Rabbi Elaine Zecker at Temple Israel here in Boston was the co-chair of the committee to create Mishkan Tefillah, the prayer book that we now use for Shabbat morning, thinking about changes in God language, and how we address God, not just in terms of the gender neutral terms, but also in terms of different words to raise up, God is the compassionate, God is the healer, different ways of thinking about God beyond just ruler of the world. So again, I want to hear from you, just sort of what did you find poignant, what came up for you as something that resonated with you, or something that where you might have a story to add to what you heard from these reflections on how we have helped change ritual. Elaine.
It's just a funny story, very similar to the first one we heard. My mother slapped me the day I got my period, and I asked her, what the heck are you doing? And I asked her why. Now, my grandmother at that time was not alive, but so her answer was, well, I don't know, but my mother did it for me. And I did that to my daughter and went through the same thing with her, that it was, again, I have no idea why. That's what I was told.
Karen.
I was just thinking about Mayim Chaim in Massachusetts, that it's just completely changed, mikveh experiences, and increased so many different new celebrations and new rituals have been created around Mayim Chaim, at Mayim Chaim.
Right, and of course, and that was something where the primary association for women was that's what you did at the end of your menstrual cycle, and also before you got married. That plus conversion were the primary things that people would associate traditionally with using mikveh for. And what we now have are many rituals. I actually just pulled out my book of Mayim Chaim rituals from the shelf just a couple of days ago to scan and send over to a congregant who wanted to a mikveh ritual for something in particular, and I was able to reach into the Mayim Chaim book and find what they needed and send it over to them. So yes, so another example of how something where perhaps there was an initial push to think about expanding the role of something to recreate more positive associations for women who were not in that traditional mode of going every month, becomes something that now has great power as a place of ritual, not just for women, but for people of all genders, for all different needs. It's expanded so much more beyond that.
The other thing I was
Go ahead.
was the Misha Berach prayer that Debbie Friedman wrote, that it was certainly a standard part of Orthodox services, but had been pretty much completely dropped by Reform and I believe conservative services too, but just as an aside, and just became such a key point, central point to the Reform service and conservative services now as well.
Right, and that was originally written as part of a ritual that was about acknowledging a woman moving into her older years, a kind of a kind of a saging, kind of a recognition of sort of moving into wisdom years. So it was part of something else, and then it got incorporated into all of our services. Iris.
I remember Talmud. Two things. One is what I wrote on the chat is that I remember when we were in high school, we actually helped to write the prayer book for the Reform movement in Israel. I remember we had seminars, like group, and we never thought who was a guy, who was a girl. I mean, we were just sitting together, the group of us, a group of teenagers, and because the youth movement in Israel was so young, our voice was heard. In fact, our voice wasn't just heard, we were the voice. And that was kind of, and I can't tell you which contribution came from a woman or a young girl at the time, or which from a guy. Can't tell you, because it was probably most of them because I remember the people who were there, the girls were, high school. The girls were much more vocal. And then the other thing, which also has to do with that period of time in my life, is I remember one camp, summer camp, and we were required to go to prayers, and it was Saturday. There was reading from the Torah, and we assumed that the guys will go read it from the Torah, and we girls are not. And our madrich, our counselor, goes, "Why are you sitting back?" I'm going, "Because we're women, and women don't do that." And he goes, "No, you're coming now. This is your bat mitzvah." And we all in turn, not as a group, but all in turn went and they had an aliyah. And those sort of things were very, meaningful. That's why I think that while Reform rabbis in Israel, women were later than Reform men, the gap in time between when women were ordained in Israel versus men is so short, because we were always taken as part of the group. We were always part of, there was no men and women.
Right. And Debbie Haken reflected on that last week, that she, just being 10 years, younger than Sally Priesand, grew up in the Nifty, in the youth movement here, where there was exactly what you described. And so, yeah, there was a certain kind of taken for grantedness that of course we can do these things. We can all do these things. So the headset was already changing. Sorry.
Well, I'll try to say a little bit of what I was going to say before I froze. And if I freeze again, it's a sign that I'm not supposed to say these things. So I'm aware that all the women outside of Sarah Hurwitz are in some kind of progressive feminist mode. And they're working in a sense, in a non-halachic framework anymore. But Sarah Hurwitz,
Mimi's modern Orthodox.
Okay, so I didn't know her background. So Mimi and Sarah Horowitz and these women who are in the Orthodox mode, I don't think they have the wherewithal or the permission to establish new rituals. If anything, they're kind of trying to find ways to justify their distinctly separate roles as women. Most of the other women we've been hearing about very much are in a mode of, we are really on equal footing when it comes to spirituality and religion. And that is not so in the Orthodox world. Sarah Horowitz came to our rabbinic academy at a retreat, I believe it was, when I was still in rabbinic school. And I think her topic was about nida, like how the Orthodox world was dealing with nida, which is this ritual that women in the Orthodox world still go through, that when their period's over, they have to kind of prove to the rabbi somehow that their period is over. And it's a very awkward, it's awkward to even talk about it, and yet it's very much a part of their lives. It's so like out of anything in our progressive Jewish world, and yet they're still so immersed in that. So it's a really different scene to be a rabbi in the Orthodox world and a rabbi in the rest of the Jewish world.
it would be a much longer conversation that we don't have time for in this sort of just trying to touch on a lot of themes tonight. But I would say, though, that having spoken to a couple of the women who work in that field, that they have also brought innovation and creative ritual and because they are approachable and have been able to engage in women's lives and women's worlds within the Orthodox framework, as you've just given an example, but they are making a difference. They're not just fulfilling a role, but they are making change as well. I saw a couple more hands, so let's just try and get a couple more responses in. Carol and then Eva.
I grew up in an Orthodox world, so most of my ritual comes from or came from the Orthodox. And when I had a miscarriage, and then I had a son. And because I'd had a miscarriage, at that time I wanted to have a pinyon of ben, and they wouldn't let me because my womb had already been open. And I remember saying, I don't get it. This is my first child. It's a boy. I want to do it. And then as far as, it wasn't until the girls, until I got into Reform Judaism that actually the girls were named anywhere, because those rituals just didn't exist. So when I went into Reform Judaism, it was so different that sometimes I felt lost.
Right. It's not just, we're going to, in a moment, get to the third theme, which is as people got used to engaging with women in leadership and women as rabbis. It's not just men in congregations that had to get used to things. If you grew up a certain way and you were used to certain things, resistance to, women on the bima and reading from Torah and women being rabbis could come from other women as well. And has done in some communities. I'm not putting words into your mouth. I'm not saying you're resistant to it, Carol, but just it's the lack of familiarity can lead to different responses regardless of what the gender of the person is who's responding. Eva, let's get
I wanted to be a rabbi. At one point, I wanted to be a rabbi, but that was just unheard of. And the rabbi said, "Well, you can be a Rebbitzin." I said, "No, I don't want to marry one. I want to be one."
Sally was told the same thing. Right. Yeah. So yeah, that resonated. Eva.
So I'm just reacting from an emotional place. I really felt connected and touched by all the rabbis that just spoke about ritual. And what just came to me is the fact that female rabbis, women rabbis have helped, and even non-rabbis, but women leaders have helped to bring Judaism, everyday Judaism, down to earth, from up there, down to earth. And the word that comes to mind in terms of, we talk about many names for God in Suri's class, the word Shekhinah, which has several definitions, but to me it's always like the feminine essence of God. And it just feels like there's a softness, a compassion, a love that women have been bringing all throughout history, but now in an official capacity, which is I believe changing at least progressive Judaism and conservative, I think, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Conservative.
Okay, well, thank you. I know I'm kind of spinning us through. As it is, I'm looking at the time going, oh, I'm not sure I'm going to get all of this in, but I'm going to try. We may go like if people are willing, 10 minutes late, just to try and cover a couple more bases. So I do want to, just without spending a lot of time on it, just raise up the voices of people over the decades where the challenges they faced they never went away. my reflections at the beginning of this evening, they've never gone away, even though things seem to have gotten vastly better. So we're going to start with Ellen Dreyfuss, who actually Rabbi Haken made mention of. She was ordained just 1 year before Debbie, 1979, and had been, pregnant and as she was coming towards the end of rabbinic school, determined initially to work part-time. And Debbie had made mention that that was actually something that was challenging, not only to Ellen looking for work, but also that there was sometimes, feelings among some of the other women that this was sort of sending a message that, women were going to get pregnant and not be available and be unreliable. And so there were some women who gave her a hard time. But Ellen went on to be, a remarkable rabbi and leader. I'm going to just share, I don't have time to do it all. I'm going to share one of her snippets that I had lined up here. It's called the Bogus Job Interview.
Since I grew up in Chicago, I knew most of the senior rabbis from camp and from just growing up around and being involved in youth group and stuff like that. And so there was an assistantship open. I called up the senior rabbi and said, tell me a little bit more about the position. I'm interested. And he said, well, we're really looking for somebody to do kind of outreach to the yuppies in this community, this urban neighborhood. So we'd really need somebody to live right here and kind of open their home. And I said, well, that sounds really intriguing. He said, but you live out in the south suburbs, it wouldn't work. I said, well, if the job is right, and if we decide that we want to do that, we could move into the city and my husband would commute. And he said, look at the snow outside, you would have such a cranky husband. I said, nevertheless, I would like to be considered for the position. Then I got a letter back, and there were evidently two factions in the congregation, and one of them was looking for this outreach to the yuppies, and another was looking for someone with more experience and kind of a more senior associate. So they wrote back and said they were looking for someone with more experience. So I had been out 5 years at that point, but I had been working part-time and in different kinds of things. So I figured, okay, they're going to take somebody from the field. A couple of months later, I hear that they're interviewing the seniors at HUC. And I got angry. So I called up Rabbi X and said, I don't think I'm being treated fairly. And he said, well, we really need somebody to be doing this and this. And I said, you don't know anything about me. I said, all you have is that one sheet of paper that you got from the placement office. You don't know about the management experience I have before I went to rabbinical school. You don't know about this. You don't know. And you'll never know because you didn't interview me. Now, this was on a Wednesday night. Thursday morning, I get a phone call from him saying, we've arranged an interview. We've scheduled an interview with you on Saturday after services. Completely inappropriate. And, well, it was CYA. I mean, I think they were afraid that I was going to sue them. But the interview was also kind of surreal. Somebody said, we noticed that you're a woman. How do you think that that will affect, how you are as a rabbi? I mean, this is 1984. This was not, 1924. Someone actually asked me, are you going to have any more children? Now, I could not say, that's an illegal question, you idiot, because they would say, oh, what a bitch, So I simply said, I don't have any plans. And finally somebody, and the whole thing was just kind of bizarre. Finally somebody says, what kind of compensation would you require? Now, you never ask money in a first interview. It's simply not done. So I smiled sweetly and said, I'd rather not discuss money on Shabbos. I said, if we decide that we want to work together, I'm flexible and so are you, and I'm sure we can come up with an appropriate amount. Well, needless to say, that Saturday, the reason they scheduled this at such a bizarre time was that Saturday night was callbacks for the HUC students. And they hired someone right out of the college who had the correct genitalia, who was the same height as the senior rabbi, and I was considerably taller. End of story.
There's a lot to take in there, but I am going to let you take it in while I move on to Carol Balin.
I would say there were far fewer roadblocks to my becoming a rabbi than to being a rabbi once I became a rabbi. The kinds of comments people just pass off unwittingly, naively, ignorantly, happen all the time. Even now, with a plethora of women in the rabbinate, the folks just aren't used to it unless you follow a woman to the rabbinate. When I was a student at HUC, I had a rabbinic internship with a woman rabbi, and I chose that internship because I wanted to see what it's like. And so my being an intern there was not at all an anomaly or strange or off-putting. But later on in my life as a rabbi, I've experienced lots and lots of questioning and wonderment and confusion in some cases over the fact that I'm a woman and a rabbi. The woman who is my children's pediatrician, who of course you can imagine has been a great source of support to our family over the years. I have 3 children, was getting married. And I'm talking to her about her wedding, and like most rabbis, I asked, so who's officiating at the wedding? It's the kind of thing we rabbis ask. And she said, I don't know. You know, my father's a Holocaust survivor, and though we're not so observant, you know, he's kind of adding his 2 cents, and he wants a more traditional kind of ceremony. And I said, you know, no, Marla, no pressure, but you know, if you want me to get involved, I'd love to. It would be an honor. She said, you know, I would love that. She went home, she spoke to her fiance about it, she gave me a call, and she said, you know what, we'd like you to do it, but here's the thing, my father, Holocaust survivor, does not feel so comfortable with a woman rabbi. What should we do about that? I said, no problem, I'll get one of my male colleagues, and we'll go officiate, and we'll do it. And we did the ceremony, and it was really moving. She's a very extraordinary woman, and it was, of course, very meaningful for her family, the only daughter. And after the ceremony, her father came over to me, and he said, he gave me a big hug and a kiss, and he said, I never kissed a rabbi before. That was quite a ceremony. And you know, this was these were the words of a 70-plus-year-old man who lived through a war, whose relationship to Judaism was from the old world, who had never met a woman rabbi, and let alone kissed a woman rabbi. And there was a great deal of vulnerability that was expressed in that moment, of fear, of ignorance, of discomfort. But I hope that that moment was transformative for him in some ways.
I'm going to
I still go into life cycle events with families, a wedding, a death, a funeral, a shiva house, where there's a tension among siblings, let's say, who have lost a parent about, are we comfortable having a female rabbi? That still gets happened. Or I counsel couples all the time, well, the father of the groom is really uncomfortable and wants a male rabbi. And that still happens, I would say, on a regular basis. It's better, certainly, but it's still certainly a struggle. Though I think the issues surrounding gays and lesbians is certainly sort of on the more sort of cusp in terms of being much more raw for people. And we're still many steps back in terms of equality and acceptance of those things. I counseled, a rabbinical student came to me recently and asked for some advice about going through the interview process. He was completing his time at seminary, and he was talking about, you know, how out to be when he went through that process. So I think that's still a very big issue. As a woman, you don't have that choice anymore, and ever, you never had that choice. You were out because you were a woman. But as a gay or lesbian rabbi, you have to decide, like, how much information do you want the congregation or community to know, especially if you don't have a partner. So that certainly is a more cutting edge issue. But I think I would be interested to sit around a room with female rabbis who say that it's not an issue anymore. Maybe in the reform movement it's different, but certainly in the conservative movement I still face those questions about female rabbi, authority, authenticity, and have to answer a lot of questions about me and who I am as a woman and my rabbinate.
Okay, I'm going to pause there just because I had a couple of others, but that's enough, I think, to get us a taste. I'm really struck in the last two that I played between Carol Balin, who was ordained, in the Reform movement, and, maybe a good 10 to 15 years before Eliana Yalkut, who's in the conservative movement. That Carol seems more compassionate to, the Holocaust survivor, the 70-year-old man, and his lack of familiarity. And the younger generation has less tolerance of that. And I think that there's something to that. I think that I heard that in what Debbie Haken shared last week. I thought she was much more gracious and tolerant in how she sort of internally responded to some of the interactions that she'd had over the years than perhaps I would be. And that may be a product of the times in which we grew up in, and the assumptions we had outside of the profession that we're in, that we then bring to our expectations about how people will engage with us when we're doing our job. But anyway, just some of those issues. And anybody have a reaction to that little grouping before we move on? Nancy, go ahead.
I am astonished by the fact that we all lived through the 70s and it's still people react like that. This is just beyond me. I mean, I grew up, I was a teenager in the 70s, and I believed a woman could do anything they wanted to do. So it didn't surprise me at all when I came to Congregation B'nai Shalom and they had a woman rabbi. I was thrilled by that. I don't get it. Where have these people been? Under a rock? I just don't get it. I mean, my husband will say things to me like, oh, women are making men feel insignificant and blah, 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 and all these things. And I'm like, well, it's about time.
Nancy, it's funny that you should bring that up as an example, because one of the clips that I did not show from another conservative colleague, a friend of mine, Rabbi Rebecca Serbu, she talks about the issue that some people say, are men feeling like they don't have a place in ritual or in leadership anymore, or in synagogue life and leadership. I have to say, our congregation, our board has remained very balanced. I mean, we don't count exactly, but we've always had men and women in leadership, and so the culture of this congregation is not typical. There are other places where it's that those conversations do take place. But what is often pointed out, I mean, if you think about our congregation, apart from a night when I might be on the bima with Rabbi Iderson, is there'll be nights where it's me and Sharon or me and Lisa, and so all of the people leading are women. But for many, many, many decades, nobody looked at that and went, oh, it's only men who are leading, right? That wouldn't be comment worthy, but the opposite sometimes is. Natalie.
Yes, and the point you just made is something that actually Debbie mentioned last week, that she used to hear that a lot. And it goes back to actually the comment I made earlier about some of it may be differences in personality. Some of it may just be maturity and comfort in your own skin and recognizing your place and your role and deciding how much you want to fill that role and how much you just want to be who you are and put your head down and go about your job versus taking note of the historical opportunity that you have. And I was really struck by Rabbi Balin's attitude. She was very gracious, and she acknowledged and she understood where people were coming from and tried to reach out in a way that made them comfortable while still doing what she was doing. She opened doors rather than confronting them. There's I think a time to do both. But in any one situation, you have to choose how you're going to respond.
Yeah, absolutely. Karen.
Just reflecting I had certainly many instances as a female physician where I ran into this, but one of them, I think your attitude toward it does change, as other people have said, but probably about 6 years ago, I was in an office. I was the only physician in the office. There were no other assistant. There were no physician assistants or anything. There were no male people in the office at all. And my name is Karen. And this man came in to see me for the first time. And my name's on the door. It says Dr. Karen Rothman. And I came in and I sat down, and he said to me, he's a man in his 30s. He said, "You're a girl." And I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "But you're a girl." And I said, "There's a lot of things about myself that I can try to change, but that's not one that I choose to." And he ran out of the office. And so, I've had many other instances, but at this point in my life, it was very sad, but also like humorous that he was so, I don't know how he didn't get the clues somehow along the way, but it took sitting there and actually seeing a female physician. I don't know how, apparently he had never encountered one before, but so even amongst the younger generation, some of them are still clueless. But I also want to mention one other thing, and that is that the history of our congregation, yes, we have had many females in leadership, of course, but also not in the last 10 years, but prior to that, there was a concern amongst people who were choosing people for the board that there were too many females in leadership. And there was certainly an attempt to always make sure that there were enough males represented, even in the face of females who probably could have held the roles better, to make sure that there was an even number, or if women should not outnumber men on the board. And that finally stopped. And it was something that I fought against for a very long time, and then just basically gave up, but it died of its own natural death eventually.
So even Congregation B'nai Shalom was forward thinking as we have evolved. Okay, I hope if I may keep people maybe 10 more minutes, I would love to just play one more series, because this is really kind of puts a sort of a kind of like a summary over the whole thing, given that we have to stop. If anybody does have to jump off, just a reminder that next week is our Evening with Sally Presand. Please note the earlier start time. It had been set previous, to me setting this series up at 7 o'clock. So it's half an hour earlier, but we'll be sending out publicity. First round will go out tomorrow, and then there'll be a couple more reminders next week to try and make sure that people know about it. 7 o'clock. Okay, so what kind of change have women brought to the rabbinate over 50 years? And we're going to hear a number of different perspectives on how we might frame this. So let's start off with Rabbi Elise Goldstein, who's a wonderful rabbi based out of Toronto.
I think the changes are obvious, and I think they're huge. In my last book called New Jewish Feminism, in the introduction, I say that there's been no revolution in Jewish life as big as the revolution of the engagement of women in religious life since emancipation. The leaving of the ghetto for Jews in emancipation, in my mind, is equal to the ordination of women. That's how big a historical movement it's been. Because everything you knew about Judaism was called into question, because everything you understood about gender roles was called into question, because the very existence of women in the rabbinate challenged the notion of spirituality, of God the Father, of non-feminist theology, of the disengagement of women. These are all deep, deep changes. It has nothing to do with the fact that there was just a woman on the bima. It's the concept of having women as leaders of the Jewish people that radically changed Judaism, that caused people to ask the question, where are women in this text? That caused people to ask the question, why is this law for or against? Can women, can't women, should women, shouldn't women? That caused people to ask, what is the Judaism that we've inherited? Is it a Judaism that has been understood by men, for men, through men? Or is it a Judaism of all the Jews? And these questions were asked only because women were in leadership positions. It has radically, radically changed the face of Judaism. I think obviously for the better. And it'll be the same thing for gays and lesbians as they take leadership roles. Judaism will not be destroyed. It'll be the same thing for forward-thinking Jews. The reality is we really have two kinds of Judaism today. We have progressive thinking Judaism and we have traditional thinking Judaism. The biggest challenge for Judaism is not women in the rabbinate. It is getting these two Judaisms to talk to each other. It is getting these two Judaisms to live together. It is getting non-Orthodox Jews to take responsibility for the future of Judaism and to stop abdicating it and to stop saying, well, if it wasn't for them, there'd be no Judaism. We have to start saying, if it's not for us, there'll be no Judaism, because frankly, we are the Judaism of the future. In 200 years, I really cannot believe that there will still be Polish dress-wearing Jews who live in the 18th century. There will still be a pocket of them, just like the Amish. But the Amish are not the mainstream of Christianity, right? Liberal Protestants are the mainstream, and liberal Catholics are the mainstream of Christianity. So my biggest question for the Judaism of the future is not the role of women. My biggest question is, when will liberal Jews take full responsibility for being the Jews of the future?
And chew on that while I bring you Rabbi Jackie Tabik, who was the first woman to be ordained in the UK, 1975.
West London was lovely. It was a great congregation. But when I was first qualified, they wouldn't appoint me as rabbi because they were worried that this had to go to an annual general meeting and what would happen. So I was appointed actually as education officer, which was fine. I enjoyed that. But I did funerals and I took services, but I wasn't allowed to take High Holy Day services. So I used to, one year I went and took them at the same synagogue that I'm now working at, which is quite a coincidence. But one time I was sitting in the synagogue in the overflow service, and Rabbi Lionel Blue, lovely, lovely person, suddenly became ill and wondered whether Rabbi Tabik could possibly come up and take some of the service. And I really blessed him for that. And there was no thunderclaps, no lightning. And after that, I took the service. But you have to understand how difficult that was for West London. The overflow, we had mixed seating. But in the synagogue at that point on the High Holy Days, women sat upstairs, the men downstairs. So if I was on the bima, after I came off the bima, I had to go upstairs to sit. So it wasn't easy. Within a couple of years of me taking services, the women had all come down and forced some men up, and there was mixed seating.
I'm going to come back to Carol Balin. By the way, Carol teaches as a professor of history at Hebrew Union College, so she has a wonderful way of reflecting on the big picture.
Women didn't just enter the rabbinate overnight magically. A context had been created for that event to emerge. And that context meant challenging views about God and how we describe God. I don't mean challenging God's existence necessarily, but I mean challenging ways we talk about God. When you start to see a woman reading Torah weekly on a Shabbat morning, and you see girls becoming bat mitzvah, and girls doing everything the boys are doing in a synagogue, well then, when you're reading in a prayer book, a siddur that uses exclusively masculine language, you start to wonder and you start to question in ways that hadn't been asked before. Again, the questions already were being asked prior to 1972, and when Sally Priesand became the first rabbi ordained by a rabbinical seminary. There are examples in history, of course, of private ordinations, in Europe especially, far and few between, but there are. But when you start to see women in those roles, and they are changing the face literally, it starts to change things figuratively. Another example is the way that we celebrate women's lives. For the first time, you you had girls becoming bat mitzvah in ceremonies officiated by a woman. What did that mean for a girl, right? What kinds of latitude did that give her? What kinds of sense of self did that give her in ways that she obviously got in just becoming bat mitzvah, the day itself and the study leading up to that event, but actually having women side by side with her at the bima, I think is a very, very powerful, transformative experience, especially for 12 and 13-year-olds. And I think that's one example of many, many, many we could multiply over the nearly 40 years that women have been in the rabbinate.
A couple more. Joy Levitt, ordained by the Reconstructionist movement, has been the head of the JCC in New York for the last couple of decades.
I really hope that women in the rabbinate is not a radical transformation of Judaism. I hope that it is the natural extension of a tradition that is elastic, plastic, ever widening to include more and more people. That's how I read Judaism. So radical transformation would say we came from a misogynist, patriarchal, oppressive society and we broke that. That's not how I read it. I respect those who do. I just don't, I've never read it that way. I've read it as we've adapted to the changes that we saw possible at every stage of our history. We took the very best from the societies in which we lived, and what America had to offer in the mid to late 20th century was inclusivity for women, and we rode that wave, and that's part of the muscles that we've developed since the beginning of Judaism.
And last but not least, Dalia Marks is ordained from in Israel, and she is now a professor teaching at Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem.
Well, I think looking back from a perspective of time, the inclusion of women in the rabbinate would definitely be deemed or looked as one of the greatest revolutions in the contemporary era. Absolutely, yeah, because changes in the halacha were always, but here you have a very radical thing that, you know, half of the population didn't have a chance to have public roles, not only as rabbis, but also as prayer leaders, teachers, cantors, Torah readers, all these occupations, all these things that women do now were not part of the, you know, half of the Jewish experience was not documented, or it's not that women were not spiritual or they didn't do things for themselves. Of course they did, but the fact that, you know, it becomes a public, and absolutely, I think this is one of the greatest revolutions of our time.
So a lot of different perspectives, some of which somewhat contradict each other. So what do you think? Last words to you. You heard a number of different perspectives. What do you think, Karen or Gordon, whoever was going to speak?
It's Gordon this time. So, I mean, I think that women's role in Judaism reflects the changes in the general culture around us in terms of what the role of women in society. We saw that starting to change in the late 1800s, 1900s with the right to vote. And certainly in the 60s, it kind of got propelled forward and into the 70s. And then, you know, in line with what was happening in the world around, women start taking, you know, becoming accepted to HUC and taking on stronger and stronger roles. And while there's still, unfortunately, somewhat of a glass ceiling in many, I'm not saying it's by any means perfect, I think that the general trend and trajectory of society is to be more egalitarian. And I think that just Judaism, at least progressive Judaism, is reflecting that societal change.
Thank you. Yes, Natalie.
Rachel, I think you raised this point a little earlier, and these were discussions we used to have a long time ago. As there are more and more women in the rabbinate, or more and more women in leadership in a synagogue, for example, on the board and other responsible positions, men feel more threatened by it. And I don't know what to do with this whole phenomenon of when women move into a kind of a position of leadership, the position gets devalued. And what comes to mind is historically, for example, in the Soviet Union, Karen has talked a lot about the challenges of being a female doctor. And it wasn't so many years ago, but it's still challenging, I think, in many fields. In the Soviet Union, when there are lots of female doctors, but doctors are not highly respected in society. And I don't know what to do about that. Part of me says, this is your problem, go and deal with it. But it's not, it reflects on us too. And I don't know, we just have to grab it and make the position a dignified, important position, and graciously and gently teach people that we bring something of value to these positions, and we should be valued for it. It brings up issues of pay parity and other kinds of equity, but it's more than that. It's social standing, and I don't know how to fully understand that and fully grapple with that.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I remember studying this, 25 years ago, and sort of my cultural geography, sociology background, looking at those, changes in which as women entered something, right, the status of that particular field went down, and the pay associated with it, and so on. And so we have seen those trends, and it's something that you don't want to see in the rabbinate. The rabbinate, that piece of it is complicated a little bit, particularly when you bring up issues of sort of pay equity and compensation that is aligned with the training that goes into the rabbinate. It's complicated by a scene now in which there's a lot of pop-up alternative ways in which people are claiming the title, and are actually putting downward pressure on things like salaries for the work, because the seminaries, all of the seminaries are graduate programs. Most of them are 5 years or more. So it's a considerable investment in time. And, as anybody knows, being in a 5-year graduate program, that costs you money to attend as well, even if you have scholarship. And then there are these pop-up things where you can go for an online program for 10 months. And at the end, somebody sends you a piece of paper and calls you a rabbi. And those people are hanging up their tile and making their websites, and people looking for rabbis for weddings and freelance b'nai mitzvah, or even hiring them in unaffiliated congregations who have no clue what they're looking at, don't realize what they're getting. But those rabbis are a lot cheaper. So that's not about gender. That's another piece of the dynamic that is part of the rabbinic world, that is a longer conversation we have time for right now. But it complicates the picture. Any other final reflections on that evolve, Rabbi Joy Levitt, it's just been the gradual evolution of progressive Judaism versus Dahlia Marx and others saying this is radical transformation, what bringing women into the rabbinate. It's the most, transformative thing that's happened since the Enlightenment. What do people think? Do you come down in how you read the impact from what you've learned in this course, or your own personal position on this one way or another?
I feel that I'm more comfortable at a temple with a woman rabbi. I mean, I grew up conservative. Well, my brother went to Hebrew school, but we didn't belong to the temple. But when I was in youth group, I was in a conservative youth group. And all I ever saw were men on the bima. So to me, it makes me feel like I should be there. I'm supposed to be there. It's where I belong. And that's important to me.
Yeah, Nancy, you're bringing back my recollection of the first time I ever met a rabbi who was a woman, because I grew up in, going to a modern Orthodox congregation. So I had no role models. I think I had one teacher in my entire religious school education who was a woman. That would have been a place where women could, would have been. I just didn't happen to get them. They were all men, the ones that I remember. And certainly the rabbi and the chazan, the cantor, they were all men. And the first time that I met a woman rabbi was, for me, the same time as the first time that I was in a reform environment. It was a student event, and so I can't really sort of tease those things apart, because I was so blown away by being presented by a version of Judaism that was like, oh my God, this makes sense. This speaks to me. I can be part of this kind of Judaism. But it was integrated, it was coming through the voice of a woman. So I can't really separate those things out. If my first encounter with Reform Judaism was with a male Reform rabbi, it could have been just as eye-opening and life-changing for me. But those two things happen to be sort of together. Iris.
So actually, I don't think that the idea that it's radical and the idea that it's organic are so far away from each other. Even though sounds like they're opposites, in some ways they do complement each other, because we have been moving, like Gordon said, to women in all kinds of positions. And even now, men are moving into women positions. Like I don't remember seeing a male nurse when I was a kid. A male nurse is a thing now, or a male kindergarten teacher. A male kindergarten teacher is a thing now. And so I think the blending is happening. The idea that it's organic, it comes if you go with the fact that some of the more progressive parts of Judaism it's becoming more organic, but when you go into the Orthodox, it becomes radical. So it depends. So it's radical in one place, it's organic in the other, but in a way it complements.
Thank you. And I think I'm going to let you have the final word on that, because I think that's probably how I would try and square the two things in that kind of way as well. So here endeth our 4-week series. Thank you for being with us. I hope you found it enlightening and interesting. As I said, 7 o'clock next week, it will be a different Zoom link. The Zoom link will be going out. As I said, tomorrow afternoon will be the first email that we'll put out. It'll also be in the weekly next week. So do join us, and feel free to invite friends. If there are people I am going to send it out to our colleagues at Emmanuel Sinai in Worcester. But if there are people it's open. There's no registration. You can forward an email. Don't post it in a public Facebook page, because the Zoom link will be there. But if you want to share it with individual friends, please invite them to have this opportunity to listen to Sally Priesand, who is a wonderful storyteller. So I believe you really will enjoy her. Thank you all very much, and I wish you all a very good night.
Thank you.